Hey, thank you guys for coming. My name is Chris Johnson. I'm the executive director of Bike Fort Collins. This is a pub talk on did anybody read the blog post that this is kind of based on? I wrote a blog post for Bike Fort Collins yesterday. Great, so a couple of you read it. So this will go over some of the same ground, but it's kind of broken out a little bit differently. Just as some background on Fort Collins, we're a really great bike city in a lot of ways. The League of American Cyclists has a system called the Bike Friendly America system, whereby they rank cities, or communities, I should say, communities and universities and businesses as how bike friendly they are, and it's a certification that they do. But we're really lucky here in Fort Collins to be one of 5 platinum bike friendly communities in the country, with Madison, Davis, Portland, and Boulder as the other 4. We are one of 5 platinum bike-friendly universities, which is great. Don't ask me which the other 4 are, but I'm assuming they're probably the other corresponding universities or something similar. And then we also have the most bike-friendly businesses, the highest concentration of bike-friendly businesses of any city in the country, with 53, which we're really excited about. And that's I think, another kind of unheralded and sort of important thing that's going on here. As a bit of explanation of what Bike Fort Collins is, and we get questions and confusion about this a lot. We're a not-for-profit advocacy group. We are not, in fact, FC Bikes, which is the city's transportation program, although one of the first things that Bike Fort Collins did when it was formed was advocate for the creation of FC Bikes, and I think it was kind of a stroke of genius. I can't take any credit for that. That happened before I got here, but they advocated for the creation of a city bike program within the transportation planning system, and that's been really, really instrumental in the last 10 years or so in the evolution of Fort Collins as a super bike-friendly place. We're also not the co-op. Oh, that must be why I was being weird. The Fort Collins Bike Co-op, which is a sister organization of ours, but is a separate organization. And the co-op is, if you're not familiar with the co-op model, it's a not-for-profit bike shop that allows people to earn bikes by volunteering. We're Bike Fort Collins. We're a different organization. So we are about more bikes, safe streets, one voice. The more bikes part, I think if you're here, you're a bike person probably, or sympathetic to bikes and understand the values, the impacts that bikes and active transportation can have on a community. And that's, there's an environmental impact, health impact, economic impact, community benefits of cycling. So I think I'll just skip right over that. When I do Rotary, I have to spend like 25 minutes on that part. But so we'll just assume that we're all on the same page on bikes are pretty good. They're a good thing. For the purpose of this conversation, a couple of definitions. Mode share, I'll talk about mode share and mode shift a lot. Mode share is basically a percentage breakdown of how many people are using different modes of transportation to get around. So that's primarily 4 different modes. That's private vehicles, mass transit, buses and trolleys and trains and stuff, and pedestrian and cycling. Mode shift is a pretty fundamental, pretty important concept in bike advocacy, and the mode shift is the idea of moving it away from private cars in America have a really overwhelming and disproportionate mode share of how we get around. It's about like 80% for the most part in most cities, and I think we're kind of in that ballpark too. I had a slide in here. I was going to put a slide in here, but our current mode share for bikes in Fort Collins, the kind of the best guess on what people are doing is about 8%, 7 to 8%, and our goal for our 2020 plan is 20%. That's really ambitious by American standards. There's some countries in Northern Europe that have closer to like 40, 45%. That's kind of, wouldn't it be great if someday territory in the U.S. So here's why mode share is really important. This is an interesting bit about, basically, this is American cities. We're not on here. It's major. It's large cities. We're a major city. It's large cities, but it's cyclist fatality rate against mode share, against the percentage that are biking to work. And what you're seeing here is that the more people, the upward trend line, the more people, the higher percentage of mode share, the lower the fatality rate. And that supports one of the biggest arguments in favor of advocacy is that shifting mode share, mode shift, is a really, really, really good predictor of safety outcomes for cyclists. It's about the best thing you can do. And that surprises people sometimes. So better than helmet use, better than infrastructure, better than anything else we can do. It's just getting more people on the road and biking. The intuitive reason for that is that a lot of what causes negative interactions and crashes and fatalities is people not being used to how cyclists behave or not being prepared for it. And so obviously the bigger the mode share, the more people you're used to seeing around, the safer the outcomes are going to be, the bigger the outcomes. And I should say there's a lot of other studies that support this as well. There's a lot of data, and it's kind of unambiguous that mode share is the best, if not the best, one of the best predictors of safety outcomes on roads. We're not anti-car. Bike Fort Collins isn't anti-car. Nobody benefits. I really don't believe that anybody benefits. I think the only people that like to frame bike advocacy as bike versus car or anybody versus anybody are people who think that they deserve to have the roads to themselves, and we're not those people. So we don't advocate a bike versus car mentality. And also, really don't think that our interests are at odds. I think that that we have a shared interest in mobility, a shared interest in being able to get from A to B and get to work and get to our recreation safely and in minimizing and increasing safety on the roads. We're kind of all in the same boat on that. So really the only people that benefit from making this about us versus them are people that don't want to share. And I try to avoid that. We try to avoid that. We are, however, anti-congestion, anti-pollution, anti-road rage, anti-poverty, anti-disease, anti-sprawl, and pro-accountability. But we're not anti-car. And I think, and I'll talk to you about why all those things matter and how all those things are important to bike advocacy. This is just a fun, talking about mode shift. This was out in front of Poor Brothers a couple of months ago, and this is one parking spot full of about 15 bikes and another parking spot with one car. Every one of those bikes is buying as much beer, spending just as much in Poor Brothers or the surrounding Old Town. This is Linden Street, so the surrounding Old Town area, and I think that shows you, it just gives you a really good a visual sense of one of the values of that mode shift is who hasn't spent a half an hour circling Linden and College and Old Town looking for a parking spot before meeting friends or going to a movie or something, and the idea that we can fit more people in if we support that mode shift is pretty powerful. This is an even more, I love this. There's a lot of these different ones. I think we should do a Fort Collins one. I would love to see a Fort Collins version of this. But this is even if you don't ride, even if you're never interested in riding a bike and you're going to stay in your car, is really in your interest to convince everybody else to ride a bike and stay out of your way, and you don't have to compete for parking, and road work will be cheaper. But anyway, so yeah, you can see what we're talking about here. This is the same number of people traveling. I don't think there's a caption on here, but it's the same number of people traveling by. It's 60 people or 80 people or 100 people traveling by bus. This is what 80 people look like on a bus. This is what 80 people look like on bikes, and this is what 80 people look like in their cars and how much space they take up. And if you think about it, it's actually even more because we don't actually drive, end to end like that. So it's actually much more impactful. But it's a kind of a profound way of thinking about using limited space really well. Safe streets. So more bikes was the first piece. More bikes, safe streets, one voice, if you remember, is what Bike Fort Collins is doing. Safe streets. 35,000, and I just saw this yesterday, actually. There's a new study that just came out. 35,092 Americans died in 2015 in traffic crashes and traffic violence. That's, for comparison, 47,000. 20 years in Vietnam, 47,000 people died. In 10 years in Iraq, 4,000 people have died. It's the leading cause. Traffic violence is the leading cause of death of Americans between 18 and 35 years old. That's staggering. Every time I think about that, I think about how cavalier we are about that. How if that was a disease or how if that was a foreign country that was killing 35,000 people a year, we would declare a crisis and we would really be doing something about it. But because it's a deal that we made a really long time ago, it's an act of conscience that we decided was okay a really long time ago. It's kind of an invisible crisis, and that's something that Bike Fort Collins is interested in maybe rethinking. So the even worse news. This is our first 6 month trends for the last couple of years. 2015, the first 6 month trend was 17,053. And our 2016 first 6 month trend is up significantly. This is the national safety trend for the first half of this year. We're looking at possibly close to 40,000 people this year killed in traffic crashes. It's crazy. It's unconscionable that it's increasing in that amount. So this is the share of people who are being killed. Pedal cyclists, bike riders are the most significant victims of traffic violence. The most significant increase at 12%. It's really, really sobering, really scary. a lot of reasons why, but I think one of the best is this is what the odds of surviving look like if you're hit by a car on a bike or as a pedestrian at different speeds. 20 miles an hour, you're probably going to make it. 30 miles an hour, go either way. 40 miles an hour, you're probably not going to make it. So controlling speed, controlling residential speed, creating roads, creating infrastructure that supports survivable speed and decreases speed. And we can talk about distracting driving. That's probably an entire separate presentation. But just to get started, I mean, I think that's a really, that difference. How much time do you save getting, from 3 blocks across town at 40 versus 25 is really quite something. Mode shift by itself has a safety value. Whether you're getting people out of cars and onto bikes, or whether you're getting people out of cars and onto buses, the same distracted driver. People complain about, oh, I saw this cyclist the other day and he was looking at his phone. Give me a cyclist looking at his phone any day over a driver looking at his phone. Or a walker. It's not a great thing. We'd love to have everybody paying attention. But in terms of public safety health, safety threat, there's really nothing else out there like a driver on a public road. So, and I say I'm not anti-car. I am anti-bad driver. I think it's something that we have to deal with really seriously. But, someone walking, someone on a bus, someone cycling is much less of a threat. And really, when you plan cities around multimode, and when I say multimode, that's cities, streets, and neighborhoods that are designed to accommodate pedestrians, cyclists, mass transit, and cars that equally weigh the value of all of those commuters. You get better outcomes for all of them. Everybody does well. Everybody does well. So there's no such thing as like a pro-bike piece of infrastructure or a pro-bike safety measure that doesn't also help drivers and pedestrians. When you make safer, complete streets, everybody wins. There's a philosophy emerging called Vision Zero that started in Europe, and it's kind of making its way around the U.S. So anybody familiar with Vision Zero as a safety philosophy? So Vision Zero is this idea, it actually kind of ties into this. This is I think OSHA came up with it or somebody, but it's a hierarchy of industrial safety controls, and it talks about the most effective way to change safety outcomes in a system to the least effective way. And the most effective way, so if we apply this to public streets, most effective way is eliminating a hazard. You have a hazard. Well, what is our hazard? We have 35,000 people are being killed by cars every year. So elimination of the hazard would be great. We could get rid of cars. That'd be awesome in some ways. In some other ways, it'd be problematic. Substitution, maybe eventually we can substitute the cars for self-driving cars, for automated cars. We're not there yet. Engineering controls. That's kind of where we're at. That's sort of our best case scenario for traffic safety, is creating systems that keep us away from the hazards, like protected bike lanes, protected intersections, and off-street paths, and other ways that people can get around safely on bike without interacting with the hazard. Administrative controls, somewhat less effective, and I'd call it like speed limits. Things like that. Signage are administrative controls, rules, policies, less effective. And then the least effective is personal protective equipment. And it's interesting, I think that's something that a lot of, when you talk to people about bike safety, that's probably one of the first things that comes to a lot of people's minds is, hope you're wearing a helmet. And when they talk about, when there's a crash, it's always, was the victim wearing a helmet? And that's not to say wear a helmet or don't wear a helmet, but it is to say that it's, advocating for personal protective equipment, whether that's helmets or bright safety vests or whatever else it is probably the least bang for your buck in terms of actually creating safer outcomes and safety. Supporting that is a pretty interesting cycling helmet use and fatality by country. So U.S. is over here, tons of helmet use. We're the best at helmet use. We're also the most fatalities. We have a really bad fatality rate on the road. And then over on the other end, you have the Netherlands, who have very low fatality and very low helmet use. Argues that probably there's not a whole lot to be gained. Yeah?
Sorry, yellow is helmet use?
I believe that is correct. Yes, yellow is helmet use. I believe. I'll double check that. It's cut off at the bottom, it looks like. But the correlation is pretty strong. And there's a lot of different, I just had a very long Facebook argument about why that is. And I think the best guess is probably that the countries that normalize cycling, where it's not a culture and it's not a thing that you put on special gear to do, it's just like you hop on a bike and you go to work. And more people do it that way. It's not something that's weird and kind of subcultural. So, again, I don't say that to advocate one way or the other in terms of helmet use, but it's not maybe as effective as some other systemic protections and systemic measures at affecting outcomes positively. Vision Zero, I think, so the idea, I didn't get into what Vision Zero is, but the idea behind Vision Zero is the idea that all traffic violence is preventable. So anytime you have a collision, anytime you have traffic violence, it's inherently, by definition, there's a failure of some sort that's occurred. It's a failure of infrastructure, a failure of education, a failure of attention, or a failure of equipment. One of those things has failed. And you can't call that an accident, and you can't say that that's not preventable. Alex, man, you had your turn, man. It's my turn, buddy. I'm gonna do this. So, you say, well, we can fix these things. There are solutions to these problems. There are solutions to infrastructure problems and equipment problems and attention problems and education problems. And we can achieve a Vision Zero. And I think a lot of people, the first time you hear that, probably everybody in this room, the first time you hear it goes, you can't do that. We can't actually eliminate all traffic crashes. But think about that reflexive reaction compared to when someone says, we're going to cure cancer or we're going to end hunger. I mean, those are lofty too, and there may be, horizon goals and not next week goals. But your reflex isn't to say, "Oh, we'll never do that," because it seems doable. It seems like something we can do. So that tells you something about how normalized a certain amount of traffic violence is for all of us. It's just something that there's a risk we're willing to take. It's a level of casualty that we have decided culturally that we're willing to accept. And that's kind of a problem. I think there's got to be, that's the thing is we know how to fix it. It's not like curing cancer where, you got to splice the genome and spend $1 gazillion on doing it. Ask any good traffic engineer. They'll tell you how. Advocates can tell you how. We know how to do it. It's just a matter of it's kind of going to be inconvenient for some people. It's going to change our priorities a little bit. And that's challenging, but that's kind of what bike advocacy is about and where we're going. So that's kind of some high-level stuff about the U.S. in general, but for some comparison on how Northern Colorado is doing, we're doing good and bad. There's good things and bad things going on. Bike crashes were down, and so I think the city is not comfortable calling that a trend yet, just because it's a couple of years, but they are pretty proud of it. I have pointed out a couple of times that coincides with Tessa Grieger getting here. Her second and third years here. She's not here. I thought she was going to be here, but she's doing a great job. The city folks are doing a really good job in taking it seriously after a really, kind of pronounced spike for a couple of years. They don't know. We've asked her in public events before, and nobody has a really good answer other than maybe some of the things that they're doing are working, which is to their credit. Pedestrian trending upward, unfortunately, and this only goes up to 2014. But I think we've seen, more bad news. And these are just, so these are pedestrian crashes. And we have not had a great year for that either. Yes? That's all right.
For crashes, does that mean a pedestrian in the car and a cycle in the car?
It does. Yeah. Something, reported by the police. So whatever that police report says. So the crashes involving pedestrians are trending upwards. This one, these are cut off a little bit. So Larimer County is where this gets really sketchy and not good. And if you've been reading the paper, you've seen that we're in a really bad place in terms of traffic fatalities in Larimer County. We're twice the Colorado and national average in terms of in terms of fatality, overall traffic fatality rates in the U.S. It's pretty scary. I don't think anybody in the county has a really good idea of what's going on specifically to make us so bad, other than a lot of high speeds and increased volume. This is bicycle crashes in the county. It's so small just because in terms of county roads and reported crashes, it's really hard to tell if there's a trend one way or the other. But there are. It certainly isn't getting better for bike crashes on the county roads. And I think as we develop more and have more development between cities and among, as Wellington and Timnath and Loveland get built out, we're going to have more bike activity between them. And I think there's reason to believe that's going to be a problem. So going back to this first 6 months fatality trend. What's the cause? The question then is, so what does the National Safety Council, who published this study, think the reason is? And it's vehicle miles traveled, VMT, vehicle miles traveled. I'll talk about that a bunch too. But vehicle miles traveled in the U.S. reached an all-time high in 2015, and we're on track to beat it in 2016. And their best guess as to why: cheap gas. Artificially cheap gas, by the way, poor transit options, and a lack of affordable housing that forces people to live further from work will continue to increase VMT, vehicle miles traveled, and that's a pretty strong indicator of traffic fatalities. Cosmo, what do you got?
Is the vehicle miles traveled all-time high local to Fort Collins or Larimer County, or is that nationwide?
No, this is nationwide. Although I think, actually, I think I looked it up, and I think Larimer County is up as well. And I want to say like up 7 or 8%.
Yes. Where does that quote come from?
So this study, this quote and this study are both from the National Safety Council. And it's on my, I have a link to it I wrote a blog post that this evening is kind of based on, and there's a link to this study in that blog post if you want to check that out. I will put this whole thing up at some point too. Yeah, Kevin.
So I've seen the data from like 2000 to now, and with the recession and high gas prices, vehicle miles went down, volumes went down.
And now they're back up. Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's like, and like 08 to 11, it did a pretty significant dip, as did traffic fatalities, and now they're back up to all-time high. So it didn't take much. Did you have a question, Alex? What do you got? No, he's just joshing me. So this is kind of a little bit all over the place, but it's important, and it'll all come together, I think, by the end. But this is from the Fort Collins Board of Realtors, and what this is the affordability index for the city of Fort Collins, not Larimer County, but the city of Fort Collins. And how the how the affordability index works is it's a comparison of median household income and median home price. And as long as it's over 100, then that means that the average median income in Fort Collins is higher than the average median home price in terms of affordability. When you get below 100, if you have a negative or less than 100 affordability index, what that means is less than half of your population. The average, or rather median, home price is greater than what is affordable for the median income in the city. So what that tells you is that, and it doesn't necessarily tell you, I actually had some conversation about this today with economic development. It doesn't tell you with certainty that less than half the people are living here. It just tells you that less than half of the population can comfortably afford to live here. So there might be people that are below that average that are spending 45 or 50% of their income on housing, which is unhealthy and is obviously bad for consumer spending and not sustainable in a lot of other ways. We're trending in a bad direction. I don't know how legible those are, but that's 14, 15, and 16, and this is the trend. I'm sorry that these are cut off a little bit, but the gist of it is that we're trending down, and we're actually very close for single-family homes to basically the average family in Fort Collins not being able to live in the average house in Fort Collins. That's a pretty scary trend, and that's one of our big challenges here. So yeah, just Fort Collins is approaching a tipping point of affordability. Currently, we're just over 50% of the workforce living in the city. Boulder, for example, for kind of a contrast, is at 30%. So 30% of Boulder's workforce can afford to and lives in the city of Boulder, and everybody else drives in or comes in some way. So it's pretty scary. So what do you get? You compare the housing affordability index and fewer people being afforded to live in Fort Collins with vehicle miles traveled and that escalating. That gives us kind of a scary picture about the future of bike transportation and sustainable transportation in northern Colorado, which is to say, if people are driving in from Wellington or Timnath or Loveland, they're a lot less likely to ride their bikes. They're not going to take public transit, probably. And they're contributing to our VMT, and they're contributing to the dangerousness of our roads. Working class, working poor, increasingly can't afford to live here. That is a really serious problem. I think we're taking seriously at a lot of different fronts in Fort Collins. And then when you look at low and moderate income households in the U.S. spend 42% of their annual income on transportation, while middle income and above spend 22%. So think about the increased burden of transportation that puts on. That's a horrible disparate impact on low-income residents as it becomes harder and harder. We still need people to work here. We still have a workforce. Our workforce is pretty much inelastic. CSU and all of these need a working class. We have to have it to work. So it's not like we have fewer jobs for the working class and for the working poor. We just have fewer rooms for them to live in. So we're kind of gradually pushing people out. This is just a little, it's more funny than anything else, but this is if we plan roads the way we plan bike lanes. It's like all of a sudden you're on a train track instead of on a bike lane. I always like that. So safe streets, that was safe streets. That was our safe streets piece. One voice. Who rides bikes? Why? This is kind of a breakdown. And again, the ones that I don't have attribution on, I can get you attribution or we can put on the website. Low income, poorest is 31, so almost a third of bike trips are by low-income Americans, and it kind of, the third quartile is the second best represented, and then the second and fourth are less well represented, but it's not terribly distributed. People of color make up the fastest growing demographic in cyclists in America. African Americans are growing the fastest, doubling in a decade. But by contrast, whites have only increased 22% in the last decade. Hispanic and Asian rates are also growing fast, 50% and 80% respectively. That's according to the League of American Cyclists. They've got some really good stats about this kind of stuff. Immigrants, twice as likely as US-born Americans to ride bikes. Low-income immigrants in dense residential areas, 10 times more likely. That's kind of interesting, I thought, as a stat. Women are outnumbered by men 2-to-1. Love that quote. I use it whenever I can. Let me tell you what I think of bicycling. I think it's done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. It gives women a feeling of freedom, self-reliance. I stand by and rejoice every time I see a woman ride by on a wheel. Picture of free, untrammeled womanhood. I think that's a pretty great quote on why we should probably be doing more to encourage that number to shift a little bit, that ratio to shift a little bit. So in terms of livability of our city, I think it comes as a surprise to people a lot of times that about 30%, just over 30% of our PSD students are actually on free and reduced lunch. I'm involved in a lot of equity groups and conversations, and I think people are often, we get a response a lot that is like, well, we're not Detroit, or we're doing fine. And people, because of the way we plan more suburbanized communities, it's a little easier to ignore or not be made aware of the fact that we do have hunger problems and we do have poverty problems and racism problems in northern Colorado, and that actually plays into what we were just talking about in terms of who's riding. Safe Routes looks really different from neighborhood to neighborhood. We work with the Safe Routes program really closely, and if you are a student at Lesher Junior High School, it looks a lot different. Your Safe Route access looks a lot different than if you live in North Fort Collins and you're going to Lincoln Middle School. It's kind of sobering how even in a platinum bike-friendly community, we have really, really significant disparities. We also, more good news. I'm like full of good news tonight. I was just on a committee that was talking about affordability for seniors. We are looking down the barrel of like a really scary affordability crisis for senior citizens, especially that have assisted living needs. We don't have a plan. I mean, we're 10, 15 years away from like really having a displacing effect of not being able to accommodate and seniors not being able to afford to live here. And then that forces people out further. That's another thing that contributes to this idea of people that you have to kind of buy your way into bike lanes and buy your way into safe streets and access to the city. And obviously, if you have assisted living needs as a senior and you're living far removed from services, it's socially alienating, socially isolating, and that's it's a challenge to this inclusion that we want to try to create culturally. So we're a robust town. We've got a lot of different bike subcultures. And we're really interested, Bike Fort Collins is really interested in bringing everybody that relies on or even just enjoys bikes as transportation together to solve these problems together. We do this we have a blog that's got basically everything that's going on in cycling in northern Colorado. We do a lot of events that are targeted at kind of breaking down. I think it's fair to say that maybe there's some elitism or snobbiness associated with bike culture sometimes in well-developed bike culture areas. We're really, really interested in figuring out how to develop a bike community and develop a bike advocacy that listens more, that's more reflective of the needs of everybody who rides a bike, everybody who relies on active transportation to get around. So this is what it comes down to for me, and going back to tying that all up, more bikes, safe streets, one voice. If we really want to unite as one voice, if we really want to serve and include all bike riders, if we really want more people to ride, if we really want safer streets for all users, we've got to work hard to create communities that are affordable and inclusive. And that one of the best tools, I think, that anybody, there's a lot of different people that are looking at this from different angles. There's social services groups, there's economic development groups, there's realtor groups, there's us, there's all kinds of people that are concerned about this affordability and what it's going to do to our social fabric. And one of the best things that I don't think is really controversial among people that are trying to solve the problem is an idea that we really need to rethink our city planning in a way that encourages new urbanism and encourages some more density than we currently have. And essentially, do we have any planners or anything in here? I'm like talking out of my grade. So new urbanism is an idea that's not as scary. You hear urban and it sounds scarier than it really is. But urbanism is simply the idea of creating people-scale neighborhoods and activated public space. It's smarter land use that creates community and connectivity. It reduces reliance on cars and makes safer communities that are accessible for everybody. 8 to 80. There's a movement out of Bogota, Colombia, called 8 to 80 cities. It's about if you can't safely let your 8-year-old run around, or you can't, as an 80-year-old, safely get around your community, you're doing something wrong. You need to keep working at it. I think it's a really interesting, fun way to think about it. So, I mean, the underpinnings of it, it's like, bigger public parks, smaller private yards, more public transit, fewer cars, more shared amenities, less underused private space. We all have so much private space that we're not using most of the time. That could be, if we were interested in creating more inclusive communities, we could have less private space, have less of that underused private space, and more public and shared. Mixed use development. So the big kind of, I think, core idea behind new urbanism is mixed use development, and that's the idea of building up a little bit, and I think people reflexively twitch a little bit when you talk about that in Fort Collins, and I think they think that we're going to be, skyscrapers and Blade Runner, and if we do that, and that's not the point at all. It's just a little, if you think about going up 4 stories increases the carrying capacity of the land a huge amount, without making it a blight, without making it skyscrapers and that sort of alarmist language that you hear from people that are opposed to it. There's 2 really good opportunities right now. To encourage that sort of mixed use. There's big redevelopment projects going on. The old Kmart, Kroger owns the old Kmart at Prospect and College, and it would be, how great would that be to see that as some sort of mixed use instead of just another big Walmart or another big King Superstore where it's just like, 2/3 parking lot that's half full all the time and just another big generic store. Did you raise your hand? No, I just thought it was great. Yeah, it's so. And it is a great idea, and it's such a great idea that the city's actually considered it. And there's actually, within the city's planning code, is a concept, and we didn't invent the concept, it's a concept that's been around a while, but it's called transit-oriented development. And transit-oriented development is the idea of building around these things, is the idea of creating neighborhoods specifically that are mixed use and that are affordable and that are going through all this stuff. So I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but affordable housing is a significant, yes?
Speaking of that, the Kmart and the presumably the old lumberyard down in Harmony and Mason, is there any hope for those? Because they're privately owned and the city has very little leverage. So I'm curious if there's any hope for that. There is.
There's a lot of hope for it. I think the city's actually really interested in TOD, in transit-oriented development, and the thing that you hear is, well, at the end of the day, it's private property, so people can do what they want. So there's that. If they decide to be obstinate and intransigent, and they decide that's the best use of their time and their money, then that's what they're going to do. But the city economic development and social sustainability programs really are interested in, like, how can we? You don't get a shot at that very often. How often do you have a parcel of land as big as that Kmart property or as big as a Sports Authority that you can do something that's so central, that's so centrally located to transit, to the the Max Trail, or to the Max Line and to the Mason Trail and to Remington and all these things, that it's such valuable property for transit-oriented development, and it is in an overlay zone. So the city does actually have a transit-oriented development overlay zone, but it's not like the same way that other city land use codes are locked. It's more of a suggestion at this point. So if you ask me, that's one of the things that I think we'd be interested in. Like, how do we fortify transit-oriented development as a requirement rather than just like an option? We can do that already with mixed use and with residential and with density rules. There's no reason we couldn't, make it a little bit more compulsory or sweeten it or make it a little bit harder not to do it. But it's, it happens through conversations with if advocates show up, and we'll get to what advocates and people that are interested in doing can do to help and support this cause. But so the Sports Authority, the Kroger, and as you mentioned, the Harmony project, there's not a ton. It's like good infill developments that are really sweet spots don't come up all the time. So they're really important that we do the right thing. Low and moderate, I already spent that. So I think the idea too is that we think of affordable housing just as the housing units, and not as in terms of the fact that transit accounts for a huge portion of the income of low-income residents. And if you put affordable housing in a place where there's no access to transit, and you force people to rely exclusively on their cars and put them further and further away from economic activity and school and work and groceries and social services, then you're increasing that burden. So it's really important as we think of affordability, not just as housing affordability, but as a housing and transportation affordability matrix. And so we do have it's a charged issue in Fort Collins, the affordable housing thing. There's some people that are very adamant that they don't think that affordable housing belongs near them. They say things like, we think it's a great idea, but not in our backyard. We think it's great as long as it's in somebody else's neighborhood and not in our neighborhood. But it's best if it's integrated. It's best if it's not, a slum somewhere where they put all the 8-story low-income housing developments where, and a lot of times, I talk to Habitat for Humanity about this a lot. I talk to Fort Collins Housing Authority a lot. You wouldn't know where a lot of these smaller projects are. I mean, I think everybody thinks that it's going to be cars up on blocks and dogs off the leashes and stuff, and all these stereotypes that we have about the poor. But you don't know. Honestly, there's tons of affordable housing, and there's tons of. The economic vitality of the neighborhood relies on having this mixed income and having people that are connected and having people that are close together. Because again, it's not affordable if you live in Timnath and you have to spend almost half of your income to get into Fort Collins. And while you're doing so, you're increasing vehicle miles traveled and congestion and putting more burden on our road work and on our public works, and you're making it more likely that you're going to kill somebody on a bike or in another car. Density, I think density is fairly self-explanatory, but it's just how many people you can fit in a piece of land. And we have very, very low density by urban standards in this country, and in this city, we could very easily afford to have some more low and medium density development in this town. Old Town North is a really good example. If you ever are up that way, just on the other side of Vine, off of Redwood, is a really great. It's slightly more dense. It's slightly more. There's community gardens. There's community parks. Not so much big lawns. The houses are close together. They're not as set back. But it's more sustainable, and you can fit more people in there, and it does a lot of really good things for the amount of people that you can fit in a given space. Strong commitment to complete sustainable transportation. If you guys are nerds, then you know that the city manager's recommended budget just came out, and it's going to go to council over the next couple months. And one of the big offers was a Sunday transport service. That was one of the big things that was being pushed for by Transport. Was they thought that it wasn't useful until it was kind of more comprehensive. Unfortunately, that offer ended up just below. So the way the city does budget is there's kind of a water line, and if anything above the water line is recommended for funding, anything below the water line is not recommended for funding, and it's ranked. So it's kind of ranked in order of the priority of the city manager's office. Sunday transport service was the top offer below waterline. It was the number. It was like right there below waterline. I know that there's a lot of support for it in council. I know there's a lot of support for it in the city. It's expensive. It's not cheap. It's like $1.3 million or something per year. And the argument against it from city manager's office is, well, Saturday service isn't that great. We don't have that great of numbers there, so it would be irresponsible to support Sunday service. And my response to that is, that's kind of like building a staircase and leaving out 4 or 5 stairs and saying, we'll build the rest of the staircase if we see people using it as it is. Because I don't think, it's not, in low-income communities, it's not useful in replacing cars unless it's really contiguously useful, because a lot of people in low-income communities are not working banker's hours. They're not working 9 to 5. They're not working when bus service is really good. They have to be at work at 4 a.m. They have to be at work until midnight. They work shift hours. They work on the weekends. So when it's not complete, it's not useful at all. So it's not that sort of incremental approach. I don't believe that is a really useful way to look at the usefulness and the efficacy of it. This is all, you don't have to read all of this. It's just a kind of an interesting, the different benefits of mixed income neighborhoods and TOD and the added benefits of them. Truly affordable housing stabilizes transit ridership, broadens access to opportunity, and relieves gentrification pressures. So that's, that transit-oriented development piece is really, really important to the future of bike friendliness in Northern Colorado. This don't even start. I'll put this up on the website. It's just a super fun thing. It's Canadian, but the concept survives. Suburban living is really expensive. We think of I think the poor in this country as being sort of a social welfare and a social services drain on our system, but it's actually kind of the opposite. Suburbanization of America in terms of the infrastructure costs and the per person, the per household cost of suburban life is really impactful economically, not just economically, but also environmentally and socially. There's a lot of detriments, and there's a lot of arguments against this sort of just keeping it low density and just keep building out. Just keep building out further and further. and consuming more and more resources, building longer and longer streets, creating longer and longer commutes, adding VMT to everybody's commutes. So these are a lot of the other indirect costs that are associated with it. So again, I'll put this up online. You don't have to memorize it right now. And I think like I said, like I think people are concerned that we're looking at Blade Runner or Bangkok or something when we talk about urbanism. It's not. I mean, it's about activated public space. It's about walking and biking and using public transit to get around and not dedicating so much of our space to parking. And not dedicating so much of our space. See, and when you look at I didn't put the slide in, there's a great slide of Front Range Village that's just an aerial shot. If you ever just go to Google Maps sometimes and look at Front Range Village from above, and it's just asphalt. It's like 2/3 asphalt, and it's very rarely full. It's mostly just this big empty thing, and that's really valuable space. So when you shop there, when you shop anywhere in Fort Collins, you're paying for the square footage of that parking. I mean, we're paying for the lost income. That's how they pay for that parking, is by passing on the cost of the parking in everything that you buy in any of these restaurants. So there's a lot of hidden cost in kind of being so parking phobic. Conclusions. Transportation equity, and this kind of goes back to the one voice piece. This is everybody has seen this drawing by now. I think it's a kind of a standard way of explaining the difference between what equality and equity is. It's different populations and different individuals have different needs for support to be able to participate or be able to see what's going on. I think if a community suffers from infrastructure disparities, if a commute from Remington to CSU looks different than a commute on bike from Poudre Valley Mobile Home Park to working in a hotel on Mulberry, then I think it's incumbent on us as advocates and on city as agents of all citizens up here to try to figure out, before we make fancier and cuter amenities in places that are already reasonably well served, to figure out how we can bring everybody else up, how we can make transportation not an amenity that you get based on your income or your neighborhood, but mobility is opportunity. I've been talking a lot tonight about safety outcomes. And as much as safety outcomes, it's about being able to participate in public life and being able to access the rest of your community and be able to get around. And if you're less likely in an underserved neighborhood to be able to afford a car, or if operating your car and the gas is more of a burden, and you're physically isolated by bad roads or by limited roads, or by no sidewalks or by no bike lanes or by limited bus service from the civic centers of your town, that's a lack of opportunity or jobs. We actually, I was in a meeting earlier today where we talked about, if you're in a good chunk of the city, if you rely on the food bank, and the food bank is up in North Fort Collins right now, if you rely on the food bank and you don't have a car, whether you're riding or biking or taking the public transit, it's like a 2 or 3 hour thing, or like up to a 4 hour thing with a couple of transfers to get to the food bank, just to get food. So we do have a problem in this community of it's disproportionately hard to get around if you are low income. I think we're like I said, we're really well served if you're doing well, but if you're not, there's an equity problem. This is a pretty sobering national study that I don't think we know the numbers on this, and this is one of the things that Bike Fort Collins is interested in, is what do these numbers look like locally. But nationally, this is pedestrian deaths per 100,000 resident in high-income neighborhoods, medium, and low-income neighborhoods. More than twice as many pedestrian fatalities in low-income neighborhoods as high-income neighborhoods, and medium-income neighborhoods are pretty close to high-income neighborhoods. More than double the deaths of pedestrians per 100,000 people. And then if you look here, this is the same low, middle, and high income. The incidence, the percentage of street lighting, the contiguousness of sidewalks is hugely disparate. That's really scary. That's really sad. I mean, I think that's a travesty. You look at that and you go, that's a civil rights violation. That's a really horrible thing. Again, I don't know what it looks like in Fort Collins. I don't think anybody knows exactly what that looks like in Fort Collins. Bike Fort Collins would like to know better. We're working to try to get that overlay data so we can say, look, this is your zip code predicts your road safety and your outcomes, your safety outcomes. That I find kind of keeps me up at night, honestly. That stat is really sobering to me. It shouldn't be that way. No ethnic group in the U.S. has more at stake in improving bike safety than Latinos. That's, again, pretty sobering. And I think we think of bike advocacy as maybe a luxury problem. We think of it as something, particularly in Fort Collins, where biking is sort of a status signifier. It's actually the case that a lot of people are invisible in our advocacy and in our considerations, and in particular, and I think as we start looking at this more and more, we'll see that that's the case in Fort Collins too, is that we have a lot of unrepresented, unspoken for, unprotected Latino, Hispanic cyclists who have a lot to gain from taking advocacy seriously. Inside of Bike Fort Collins, we have had, I wouldn't say a discussion about whether we as a bike advocacy organization have any business weighing in on things like Sunday transport service. I feel strongly that we do. I think anything really, I know from going back to the very beginning of this, to the VMT thing, anything that reduces VMT, anything that gets cars off the road, anything that gets people out of that, anything that supports mode shift, whether it's supporting mode shift to bikes or just a mode shift to just walking or public transit or anything else, is good for our outcomes, is good for safety outcomes, is good for supporting the culture. You can increase multi-mode commutes, the idea of a bike being a valuable thing for, riding a mile to a bus station and then taking the bus and then jumping off and riding the last mile. We call those last mile connections. Those are obviously not possible on a Sunday that doesn't have bike service or late at night when there's not bus service. But I think there's a really good reason to think that being supportive of anything that gets people out of cars, of anything that creates contiguous mass transit, sustainable transit offers, is something that's worth, if you're concerned about bike safety, if you're concerned about mode share and getting more people on bikes. Not everybody's going to ride. I mean, I think realistically, the city's like over the rainbow dream mode share for 2020 is like 20%. So that's great. So what can we do with the other 80%? Well, let's get them into buses and let's get them walking and create neighborhoods and communities that support that as much as we can. So I feel pretty strongly that, and also, that's the other thing is the curbing of spending. If we are spending, if the mode share overall is so low, as 20% of people are doing something other than driving, and people are driving further and putting more wear and tear on our roads, well, it's really hard for the city to justify shifting spending and shifting infrastructure priorities away from that. I think, to the city's credit, they're pretty progressive about that, and they're always kind of leaning a little bit on how much they can spend on bike infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure and on multi-mode support versus private automobiles. And I think it's probably a little bit disproportionate, but they can only go so far. So really, anything we can do, get people on buses, that gets people out of cars, that saves money for the city, that saves wear and tear on the roads, that gives us more money to spend on smarter streets, safer infrastructure. So get involved. This is kind of the advocacy piece. This is what Bike Fort Collins is about. I think supporting public transit's a really, obviously hopefully most of you guys biked here, or you bike a lot, or you bike as much as you can. That's obviously a big thing. The visibility of more people biking, not adding to that VMT problem is great. But on top of that, supporting public transit. Write it, advocate for better service. Let your council people know this is the month with this. So the transportation budget deliberation is on September 27th. So anytime between now and September 27th, if you felt like sending your council person, finding out who your council person is, sending them an email or a letter, or maybe even trying to set up a meeting with them and say, hey, we feel really strongly that Sunday bus service, that better bus service, that more contiguous bus service is a really important thing to the future of Northern Colorado. That might be helpful. It might be really valuable. And then, obviously outside of budget season, it's helpful as well. Transit-oriented development. And now this is, again, it's not compulsory. There's no enforced land use code that says anybody that develops in a certain area has to develop TOD. But most of these projects do public hearings. Most of them go through everything goes through a development review process. You can actually sign up to get emails from development review, and you'll get an email every time there's a project, and you can look at the project and say, this looks like a really generic big box store with 2/3 of the land being dedicated to parking. I'm going to go to that thing and say, that's not what we want in Fort Collins. That's not how we want to do this. Planning and Zoning Board. I came here from Planning and Zoning Board tonight. There's lots of opportunities there to get involved. Bike Fort Collins sends out information. If you follow us on Facebook, we post public hearings and public meetings about transportation events like this. So anytime we can get, honestly, it's amazing how much you can get done with like sending 8 people to a council meeting or a board meeting. I was in a planning and zoning board before I came here. There's 8 people in the whole place. If 5 people showed up and said, we don't want this in our neighborhood, it would make a difference. Most of this work gets done by the people that bother showing up, and that's not many people. And supporting affordable housing. I don't know how many of you guys saw, there was an article in the paper about the Villages on Horsetooth project a couple of weeks ago now, 2 weeks ago. And there was literally some quotes from a woman who said, not in my backyard, which if you follow these sorts of things, NIMBY, not in my backyard, is our derogatory expression for people that say, we love poor people, but not in our neighborhood. So we call them NIMBYs. We love these things. We love social services. We love support, but do it somewhere else so that I don't have to see it or smell it or feel it or whatever it is that they object to. I have a lot of trust in the Fort Collins Housing Authority. I think they do a really good job in terms of locating projects, in terms of putting them in places that are minimally impactful in any sort of negative way. I don't think affordable housing is impactful in any negative way in the first place, but I think that they're really deliberative and thoughtful about projects. You can show up for they have, so October 13th, the FCHA project for Horsetooth is going in front of the Planning and Zoning Board. That would be a really good one if you're concerned or interested and want to make sure that we continue to develop our commitment to affordable housing, showing up in support of that and shouting down the local voices that are saying, not in our neighborhood. And literally, the woman said, there's a quote in the paper, she said, that students from non-professional households bring down classroom standards of excellence. That's why she didn't want affordable housing in her neighborhood. Literally said that in the paper. She wanted to be quoted as having said that. Even better, she was a retired teacher. So be glad she's retired at the very least. So supporting affordable housing, just creating this inclusive community where we have this vibrant multi-income community where people are together and in the same space. These are some pretty good resources. Bike Fort Collins, we have a blog, a newsletter, we're on Facebook. We have committees. We have an advocacy committee and a couple other committees that are trying to solve these problems and deal with these problems. Pedal Fort Collins is a great transportation blog. It's mostly bike stuff, but it's all kind of all about sustainable transportation. Meg Dunn, I'm sure most of you know Meg or are aware of Meg. She does great writing on these issues. She's really involved with local politics. FC Coalition for Infrastructure, Fort Collins Coalition for Infrastructure is a Facebook group, similarly involved with that. Nationally, Congress for a New Urbanism, 8 to 80 cities. And then again, if you go to the city's website, you can sign up to get info about development review. You can follow the Housing Authority updates. You can subscribe to any board and committee that you want. And you can get their agendas and what's coming before the committee anytime. And that's a really helpful way to stay involved. Again, we try to prioritize. Bike Fort Collins tries to prioritize. These are the ones that could really use a push. We have pretty good relationships with these groups that say, hey, we're really sweating this one. Could you guys come and help out? So I think the main takeaway, if you guys take anything away from this tonight, and I'll do questions if you guys want to stick around, but for me, that's it, is building bike-friendly communities requires building affordable and inclusive communities. I say this a lot. We could put a bike lane on every street of Fort Collins, but if 2/3 of the workforce can't afford to live here, we're not going to put a dent in safety. We're not going to put a dent in mode share. We're not going to put a dent in traffic violence. We're not going to put a dent in congestion. We're not going to rethink the way we do this. I know there's people that, I talk to people regularly that say things like, there's some of us who moved here 20 or 30 years ago and we feel like sold out, or we feel like things aren't the way they were and we're disappointed with how they're changing. And I'm sensitive to that, but it's not really a matter of are we going to grow or not. It's a matter of are we going to grow in a way that's sustainable, in a way that's inclusive, in a way that's safe and healthy, or are we going to grow in a way that turns us into Arizona? And no offense to Arizona, but I mean, it's this kind of sprawling, discontiguous, over-suburbanized area. I think we can do better than that. I think Fort Collins has a real opportunity now. We're a big enough city that we have problems that urban areas have to deal with, but we're small enough, and we have enough creative and smart and thoughtful people, and a lot of them are in this room, which is awesome. People trying to deal with these problems that I think we can change it. I think we can make this an inclusive community that deals with being affordable, being inclusive, and gets more people out on bikes and out of their cars. So I think that's it. That's all I got. So thank you guys. They didn't tell me when to shut up, so if anybody wants to chat, we can chat. If anybody has thoughts or ideas that we want to discuss. Anything? Does anybody have anything? Yeah.
I really liked the social justice piece that you put into this and the relationship there, and I feel like it's not an insight that many cities make, and I think that maybe gives Fort Collins an edge in the future. Also, I'm relatively new to town, and a few months ago there was a list. Fort Collins is always in a list, but a good list. But this was a list about city cities with the worst air quality.
Yeah.
And Fort Collins was on it, and I did not understand. I didn't have the time to go into it and understand that number or what the story was there. But how much is there weight behind that number? Is there truth behind that number? And how much of a role does that play in transportation decisions?
Annie, can you speak to that? Do you know anything about that?
I can speak really, really minimally to that. I work for the city, but so it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, but and I don't know for sure what list you're referring to, but there's a standard of air quality that cities are kind of expected to have, or areas are expected to have, and Fort Collins is below that level. And I think that list was calling cities out that were below the level, but it is kind of hard to grasp thinking that there's all these other cities that you can see.
I know we have an ozone problem. I don't know why.
Front range ozone, basically.
Yeah, it's just a regional
like,
issue.
Trap, I guess, I work with sustainability a little bit, but it's trapped here for some different reason, and yes, we're kind of in a unique, and the sun, the intensity of the sun does something too, so we kind of have this perfect storm of trapping ozone, but that's about all I can go.
I was curious to know how much power that had in advocating for reduced VMT.
It has a little bit of influence with respect to required vehicle emissions testing, which were gone for a while and are back now.
Okay.
Because it's mostly auto exhaust interacting with the sunlight and causing ozone, but I don't know where it goes.
We have quite a few air quality programs too, so we're running an anti-idling campaign right now. So we're really pushing that out so people will stop idling in front of schools and at the train stops and just to warm their cars up in the winter. And you can mostly go into this too. Yeah.
Do you
I'm an intern for the Environmental Services Department of the city, and I
For
work at
which?
Environmental Services, yeah. And that's where the air quality people sit at their desks. But so
They do more than that.
if you're looking for it, it's in the Environmental Services Department. The anti-idling campaign is something started by Selena Lujan, who sits in air quality, and she, exactly like you were saying, is really starting with things that just make sense, like trains and schools and places that are highly populated. But we're hoping that we get everywhere. Is if you're sitting for longer, we say them 30 seconds, depending on what light you're sitting at, then you should turn the car off.
Yeah.
So do it. You can go on the city's website and you can sign a petition saying what you're going to do to influence the anti-idling campaign.
Do you have a sense for where the air quality priority, like what kind of priority level it is?
In general, Climate Action Plan, which is going to be rebranded as something other than Climate Action Plan here pretty soon. What's that? Journey 2020. So the city has a Climate Action Plan that was adopted years ago that is hugely influential. I mean, it's like that's the thing, pretty much. Yeah, it's a really important city commitment.
Yeah. One of our city council members, Jerry Horek, sits on the regional air quality board, and so he's really passionate too. And yeah, this is really passionate. So it's up there big time.
It's interesting. So you mentioned the transportation equity piece, and I think that's a thing. That's an interest specifically that I have. And when I was actually interviewing for Bike for Collins, I didn't think I was a good candidate for the job. I had never done nonprofit work before. I was an event guy, but I had felt strongly throughout my life about equity issues, and particularly transportation equity issues, being a bike person. And so they interviewed me, and I went in front of this board, and it was a bunch of upper middle class white people that lived within a quarter mile of Mountain Avenue, and we were all patting each other on the back about how great of a bike city this was. And I said, I think we do, I kind of alluded to some of the same things that I talked about in here, is I think we have a really narrow vision sometimes as bike advocates of who's riding, of the value and importance of neighborhood connectivity and the usefulness of a sustainable transportation as a road, as an access point to opportunity, as an equalizer. And the way we've planned our cities over the years has been really, different city plans over years in different places have been really impactful. That's surprisingly impactful how much city planning has to do with, can impact equity outcomes. So I said, I told them, I was like, look at us, like who are we to be, deciding on our bike cycling priorities for, a disproportionately Latino, a disproportionately low income population. And I think we need to do a lot better job. And I think that I would extend that. I'd go even further than that to say that I think Northern Colorado and Boulder and all of us sort of greeny communities and sustainable communities, I think we have a blind spot. I think that we are not great at in the first place, there's a lot of ethical reasons and a lot of moral reasons why social sustainability and inclusion is important. It's like, that's the no-brainer. It's like, well, duh. People have basic rights to mobility and access and participation in our community. Put that aside for a second, and let's just talk about our environmental sustainability and talk about climate action plan and the future of the environment. There's an impact there on in terms of the social sustainability piece. And that, I think that goes back to what I was talking about, is if underserved communities just keep being pushed back and back and back and further and excluded and forced to drive and forced not to be part of the decision making, that has an environmental impact too. I mean, there's the whole field of environmental justice is this big thing. But I think making that connection is a real challenge that I feel is going into rooms full of people who pat themselves on the back about how green they are and how environmentally sustainable they are, and saying, yeah, but a lot of the things that a lot of the backpatting that we're doing about environmental sustainability are not socially sustainable. Like a lot of these things, there's got to be a path to environmental sustainability that includes environmental justice and includes social sustainability and doesn't displace people. And I think that's kind of a thing that maybe we're not doing as good of a job as we could be. And Kaylee and I and a lot of other people are sitting on 400 different groups that are talking about okay, then now what? We get it. How do we make that case better? And so it is a tough case to make. I think it's less. For a couple of reasons. I think it's hard. It's an abstract case. The idea that social justice is tied to inextricably from from social sustainability and from environmental sustainability. But I think it's also a thing where people don't think we have a problem. I think there's this people think we're not Detroit. We're doing fine. And it's because of, and that's the insidious thing about the sort of suburban sprawl planning that we do, is it makes it really easy to go about your day and your life and your week without seeing poor people, without seeing people of color, and thinking we're fine, we're doing good. Everybody's middle class, we all have houses, and you don't, it doesn't take far to go to North Fort Collins or go to trailer parks on the east side or go to the kind of the no man's land between here and Loveland and see that there's people in need and there's people whose needs aren't being addressed and they're being marginalized and not included in decisions that affect them by the city and by the county and by other cities. So it's a tough case to make, but without making that case, we're not going to get to any sort of environmental sustainability or economic sustainability, I don't think. So just got to try harder. I just did 20 minutes without stopping. I'm so sorry. I get worked up. Anybody else got any other questions or thoughts or anything? Come on. We got it. Yeah.
So with land and Sarah being so expensive,
with what being expensive?
Land. Yeah. Land in this area being so expensive. What is the city doing, or what ideas do you have for the city to do to? I mean, if a private developer buys a parcel for $5 million, they can't really make that cheap for poor people because they have to make their money back. So they're going to charge high rent so that they can pay back their investment or to their investors. So, do you know what the city's doing, or how are they managing forcing wealthy developers to provide housing at a low cost, which is not obviously their priority?
I don't think anybody wants to force anybody to do anything. I think let's get out. So I think the key here is that and I'm not a fascist about it either. I don't think that we should be telling people what they can do. I'm more qualified. I'm a development expert, so I'm more qualified to talk about it by analogy. And the analogy I'd say is so if you drive a car versus riding a bike, I think there's the question that I get as an advocate a lot, the way that people challenge me a lot is, why don't you guys pay registration? Why don't you have licenses? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And the answer to that is that the impact that a car has on the environment and on the road and on our infrastructure is orders of magnitude more damaging than me riding a bike or me walking. And it's why would I, if you want me to pay for my share of infrastructure, yeah, here, I'll do it. It's 4 cents. And in point of fact, we're all paying for it because we're all paying real estate tax, and that's where most of that funding comes from. It's not gas tax, in fact. So what I'm interested in isn't saying you can't drive, or you can only drive 6 miles a day, or you can't park here, or you can't put that. But let's shift the burden to be contiguous with the social impact. So let's figure out ways where if you drive more, you should, if you want to live 10 miles out of town and there's 3 miles of road that only serves you, there's 6 people that live on your road, you should be paying more for that. If you want to drive, you should be paying for that. If you want to pay for gas, the way we do it now, we all subsidize it in terms of taxes and in terms of retail cost, especially with like parking. I talked about that earlier. It's like this big, like Front Range Village is like 2/3 parking. We're all paying for that parking. Like everybody's paying for that wasted land use. So what I would say is, I think that there's probably creative way. And again, I'm not an expert. I work with, I have to trust people, and that's the coalition approach. The people I listen to are the people in economic sustainability and economic development and in the board of realtors and the people that know those numbers better. And they're all concerned and they're all working on it. But I would say we can do a lot more than we're doing to put the cost and the impact, the environmental and the social and the economic impact of decisions on the people that want to do that, instead of like broadly subsidizing that so that we're all paying for parking or we're all paying for an expensive development, because it's, yeah.
So it sounds like what you just said is if we want low-income housing, we have to make the high-income housing higher.
I think we have to, I think it's a matter of people paying for their social and their environmental impact.
Sure. I got a great deal. I live in suburban hell.
If you want to, and that's the thing, it's like, I'm not going to tell anybody what to do. I'm going to tell you, you can't live in Estes Park and commute down to Fort Collins every day for work if you want to. You can do that. That's great. But we have to figure out ways where the impact that has socially and environmentally and economically is passed on to you and not the rest of us. Because that's what happens with sprawl is there's, this percentage of the population that thinks that they're entitled to that. And it's actually coming at everyone's expense. And so it's not an entitlement, it's a choice. And if you make that choice, great, make that choice. But you got to pay for it. You got to kind of pay your way and acknowledge that like building denser and building transit-oriented development is the sustainable thing. So I think we need to come up with incentive structures for development and for business that are a little bit more economically, socially, environmentally responsible.
Also, there's been a little bit of a shift in advocacy, just like in the nuances of terms, like a cyclist, and I think there's been a shift. Just people on bikes.
I try to say bike riders. Yeah, I've been trying to get a cyclist. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that kind of addresses it too. Like, I'm not an athlete. I'm not trying to, go to the Olympics or Tour de France. I'm just riding with it. I think there is that shift.
It's tricky. Like, so one of the other BFO offers that came through that tanked, that's nowhere near the line was the establishment of an FC Walks position that would have been kind of to walking and pedestrian access what FC Bikes is. And it died. And it was like it was like $90,000. It was one staff position and some infrastructure, and that was it. And it died. And the reason it died is because, I don't know why the reason it does. I didn't talk to Darren specifically about it. But I mean, if there's not, so that's a two-way street. Like the fact that there's such thing as bike culture is a two-way street. It's the reason why, we're funded by Tour de Fat. We make my salary, literally, roughly my salary comes from beer sales at Tour de Fat. So I get to do this work because a lot of people go, woo, bikes, and like think, like that kind of sort of privileged, entitled celebration of middle-class people on bikes is a thing. And also, we do a live show once a month, the North NoCo Bike Show, that is basically my way of tricking people into like listening to like community concerns about advocacy. It's like, I'll get a pro cyclist in here or a Cosmo in here to talk about pro racing and like cool, sexy stuff. And while I got them, I'll go, hey, while you guys are here, transportation equity is like a real thing, and people are dying because there's no sidewalks in their neighborhoods. So there's the double-edged sword is we have these sort of elitist, exclusionary ideas about bike culture, and the places that have the best safety outcomes don't have bike culture. There's no such thing as bike culture. You're not part of a culture. You just use a tool to get around. So to that extent, bike culture is hurting us. It is harming us. But it also is the way I can Trojan horse me, and not everybody's doing it, but it's the way I can Trojan horse conversations about social justice and equity into people that don't otherwise care. And maybe we can use that. Maybe we can use some of that interest in, this, I mean, that's what the point of this presentation is. And this, you guys are the first ones to get the long version of this. I've been developing it for like a year, but this is the foundation of what I believe about bike advocacy, and what I think we could all do more of is like use it to convince people that think bikes are cool to appreciate the really transformative power of sustainable transportation, and why it's more than just like an amenity. So, yeah.
I was going to ask, are there any examples of U.S. cities that people use bikes as a tool? Like even Portland, maybe one of the most bikeable cities, it's a pretty elitist activity as well, at least that's the perception. So in Amsterdam, I would say that's a good example. Appeal every class that uses bikes as a tool. But what about in the U.S.? Have you discovered a city that everybody rides and it doesn't have that elitist feel?
I don't know if there's a city where everybody does it, but I think this is a pretty interesting statistic about who rides and why. And so I have a friend named Do Lee, who's an anthropologist out of City College in New York, I think, who writes a lot about, he's Korean, and he writes a lot about bike messengers and bike delivery people, and how this sort of recognized class of people that use bikes in a way that isn't part of any bike culture. And I think if you look at the numbers of who's riding, it is people that are using it in a utilitarian way. I mean, most commutes are, again, low-income immigrants in dense areas are 10 times more likely than, white Fort Collins people to use bikes. There's no culture that glorifies that. There's nobody out there that's like, pizza delivery messenger culture is awesome. But that's people who are dying and that we have to take care of, and that often don't, they don't have a voice in the work that I do particularly. I think there's a vanguard of people in my position of EDs and leaders in advocacy around the country who are doing amazing stuff for equity. They're still in a minority, and it's really heartbreaking when you hear them talk about getting shouted down by people that say, what does equity have to do with transportation, with bike advocacy? I have really good friends who I think are like some of the great visionaries of our time in terms of land use and transportation planning that just get shouted down by people that are like, what helmets, whatever. So I think that there's a lot. I think in terms of their presence, I think we do have a real problem with bike culture. Bike culture is this imaginary thing that's like you're part of it or you're not. And if you're part of it, then there's like secret language and secret dress code, and you can be part of bike culture. And that's the people that bike advocacy, traditional mainstream bike advocacy works for. And if you're not part of that, then we're not really interested in bike lanes in your neighborhood, and we're not really interested in the contiguousness of your service or your mobility or your access. And I think that there's a couple of ways that's a big failure, and one of them is that creating an elitist sort of specialized culture is marginalizing all of us, is making it like is delegitimizing sustainable transportation as a real viable future option.
So I get low-income immigrants are 10 times more likely to ride or need to ride, but there's still very low numbers, so I don't know, is there a U.S. city that you can identify or you read about that there's less bike culture than Fort Collins has or Boulder has? Just because I want to research them, I want to read about them, I want to see how they're doing that effectively. Do you get a good guess of them?
New Orleans has actually some really cool things, and I'm biased. I have a really good friend who's doing cool work there. But I think that's, so the Chicago fire 100 years ago was this great opportunity for Chicago when the whole city burned down. They said, cool, let's rebuild with all the lessons that we learned from all this bad infrastructure. And they built a really, really amazing, it was the first modern city. It's this great thing. In the same vein, New Orleans is rebuilding, and there's people that are doing amazing planning work in New Orleans around sustainable and active transportation who are, really learning the lessons of how do we create communities and plans that support the normalization. So in general, no, the mode share here is pretty dismal. Even I think Davis has the highest mode share of any US city, and it's 17, 18%. It's not great. So no, it's marginalized everywhere. But that doesn't mean it always has to be. I think there's, when I have 8 presentations I could do, and one of them is on what are autonomous vehicles going to do to all this. you know, and I mean, it's so complicated what, you know, the good and the bad that autonomous vehicles could present. And that's a thing that seems like science fiction to a lot of people. It's coming. It's 10, 15 years away from being like something that urban planning really needs to think about in a serious way. Transportation planning needs to think about. Yeah. There's actually specifically a couple of really good articles on either side of that in the last couple of weeks that are like, there's a piece of literature that came out that said they're going to just reinforce sprawl, and if we're not worried about gas and everything's electric, and we're not worried about VMT, then we're just going to sprawl and we're just going to eat up natural areas, and we're just going to kill active transportation. And then there's other articles that are like, no, we're fine. There's still incentives for living densely and for having, I think one of the big questions about autonomous vehicles is, how are they going to work? I mean, is an autonomous vehicle, are they just going to circulate and you just hail one when you need it and you jump in it? Or do they sit in your driveway 23 and a half hours a day not doing anything? And is that a good use of anybody's time and resources and stuff? So there's a lot of autonomous vehicle is this big sort of nebulous idea, but like the implementation is so important to the impact that it ends up having, whether they're private, whether they're semi-private, whether they're public, whether they're subsidized, how they're, like the whole problem of like, you're driving an autonomous vehicle, you're sitting in an autonomous vehicle, and it can either run into a brick wall and kill you or hit 6 Boy Scouts. What should it work for you, or should it work for the greater good? Like, how should we design these systems? There's like lots of really cool questions around the ethics of autonomous vehicles. And I think that little like thought experiment says a lot about how we're gonna like, does your autonomous vehicle work for you, or does it work for your community? Who knows? I don't know. Are we like totally dragging on now? We are. I guess I gotta cut it off. I'm having so much fun. Thank you guys for coming so much. This is super fun. And follow Bike Fort Collins and all those other cool. I will, yeah. I'll throw that on there. Thanks, guys.